The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was the empty patch of dirt where 20 pairs of little yellow feet should have been scratching every morning. I had just driven 8 hours back from northern Wisconsin after spending 4 wonderful weeks at summer camp with my grandkids, tired, sunburned, and already thinking about collecting fresh eggs before unpacking the car, because that's just what I'd done almost every morning for the past 11 years. But instead of hearing my hens clucking the moment my truck rolled into the driveway, I heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. I stopped halfway across my yard, grocery bags still hanging from my arms, staring at a pile of broken lumber scattered across the grass like someone had bulldozed a piece of my life and never bothered cleaning up afterward. My chicken coop was gone. Not damaged, not vandalized, completely erased. The nesting boxes my late husband, Walter, had built with reclaimed oak from his father's dairy barn were splintered into firewood. Rolls of chicken wire were twisted into ugly balls of metal. Feathers were blowing through the yard with the summer breeze, and taped neatly to my kitchen window was a bright orange notice that read, "Livestock enclosure removed pursuant to neighborhood health and sanitation concerns. Area restored to residential standards for community benefit." Community benefit. I actually laughed when I read those words, because sometimes the only thing keeping you from crying is realizing just how ridiculous another human being can be. They called it a benefit. They had destroyed my little business, scattered my registered heritage hens, wiped out something my husband had built with his own hands before cancer took him, and somehow convinced themselves they were doing me a favor. My property sits right at the entrance to Cedar Ridge Estates, although technically it isn't part of Cedar Ridge at all. My farmhouse has been standing there since the early 1980s, long before developers carved up the old Miller farmland into perfectly identical houses with matching mailboxes and endless pages of HOA rules. My half-acre wasn't fancy, but it was home. I had apple trees older than some of my neighbors, a vegetable garden that kept me busy every spring, and 20 heritage hens that laid beautiful blue, green, and brown eggs. Those eggs weren't just breakfast either. Every Saturday morning I sold cartons to families all around town. Funny enough, plenty of my regular customers lived inside the very HOA that eventually decided my chickens were some kind of public menace. 7 years earlier, their own HOA secretary, Linda Carver, had knocked on my door asking if I'd ever consider weekly deliveries because her kids refused to eat grocery store eggs after trying mine. Good neighbors ought to help each other, I'd told her. And that's exactly what happened. Every weekend I'd fill coolers with fresh eggs while neighbors stopped by to chat about gardening, weather, football, or whatever else folks talk about over a dozen eggs. Nobody ever complained about noise. My hens weren't roosters. They weren't crowing before sunrise. They clucked for a few minutes after laying eggs, and then spent the rest of the day wandering behind the coop eating bugs. County inspectors had visited twice over the years because I voluntarily renewed my agricultural permit, and both inspections passed without a single violation, which is why coming home to find everything demolished didn't make any sense. I called the number on the notice before I even unpacked my suitcase. The woman who answered introduced herself as the property manager for Cedar Ridge Estates, and before I could finish explaining who I was, she interrupted me with a voice so polished it sounded rehearsed. "Ma'am, the board determined your livestock structure created visual blight and ongoing sanitation concerns affecting subdivision property values." I asked the only question that mattered. "Who gave you permission to step onto my land?" There was a long pause before she answered. The board believed immediate action was necessary. Immediate action? Imagine hearing that from someone who had never paid a penny of my property taxes. I demanded to know where my chickens were. She claimed animal services had collected some while others had escaped during removal. Escaped. Like they had somehow chosen freedom over the home they'd lived in for years. By sunset, I'd located only 9 of my hens. 2 neighbors found another hiding beneath a shed. The rest simply vanished. Maybe coyotes got them. Maybe somebody kept them. Maybe they scattered into the woods. I'll never know. That night, I walked through what used to be my coop with a flashlight, picking up pieces of Walter's handiwork one board at a time, remembering every weekend we'd spent building it together after he retired. That's when something clicked in my head. Anger is loud at first. Then if you let it settle, it becomes very quiet, very patient, and very dangerous. While everyone inside Cedar Ridge was celebrating another victory for neighborhood appearance, They had overlooked one tiny detail that every developer, surveyor, and utility company had known for nearly 15 years. The only road wide enough for commercial garbage trucks to enter their subdivision crossed the front edge of my property under a private access agreement that existed solely because the original developer had asked my permission decades ago. It wasn't public land. It wasn't city property. It wasn't theirs. It was mine. And for the first time since reading that orange notice, I finally smiled. Because lawsuits can take years, apologies rarely come from arrogant people, but access can disappear overnight. Now, let me pause the story for just a second because this is where a lot of HOAs get themselves into serious trouble. According to standard procedure, even if someone honestly believes a structure violates a local code, that doesn't give a private homeowners association the right to walk on a property they don't own, tear something down, or remove someone's animals without due process. From a legal perspective, there is a huge difference between a county enforcement agency following a court-backed order and an HOA board deciding to play sheriff because they don't like the way something looks. This is a psychological trap that shows up more often than people realize. Once a group gets used to making rules inside its own neighborhood, it starts believing those rules apply everywhere, and nobody inside the group stops to ask whether they actually have the authority. The lesson here is simple. Confidence is not the same thing as legal power, and people who confuse the two usually don't realize their mistake until they run into someone who actually owns the leverage. The next morning, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns too much energy, and I had better things to do. I drove straight to my attorney's office carrying a weathered folder that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were my original property deed, the boundary survey from when the subdivision was built, and a stack of agreements the developer had signed back when Cedar Ridge was nothing more than lines drawn across an empty cornfield. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, spread everything across the conference table and smiled before I even finished explaining what had happened. "They really tore down your coop?" he asked. I nodded. He leaned back in his chair and tapped one page with his finger. "Well, they made one very expensive mistake. The document wasn't complicated. 15 years earlier, the developer had requested permission for commercial vehicles to cross the first 70 feet of my driveway because the county refused to approve a second entrance onto the highway. Instead of buying the strip of land, they negotiated a private access license with the previous owner, and when I purchased the property, that agreement transferred to me. It wasn't permanent, it wasn't guaranteed, and it specifically allowed termination if the owner believed continued access caused unnecessary damage or conflict. Daniel looked at me and asked, "Do you want to negotiate? Or do you want to remind them whose driveway this actually is?" I already knew the answer. By noon I had 2 contractors installing heavy steel posts sunk 4 feet into concrete. Between them hung a thick galvanized chain with a bright red private property NO commercial access sign bolted to the center. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't illegal. It simply marked the end of permission. Early Tuesday morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched from my porch as the first garbage truck rounded the corner exactly on schedule. The driver slowed, climbed out, looked at the locked chain, scratched his head, then backed the entire truck down the road before disappearing. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Mrs. Carter, this is Evergreen Waste Services. Our driver says you've blocked the service entrance." "That's correct," I answered. "There's another way in, isn't there?" he asked hopefully. "Not one your trucks can legally use." There was silence before he politely thanked me and hung up. Wednesday afternoon, the neighborhood social media page exploded. Residents posted pictures of overflowing trash cans. Someone blamed the sanitation company. Another blamed the county. A few people demanded refunds from the HOA. Nobody knew the truth yet. By Thursday afternoon, raccoons had discovered the buffet. Trash bags were ripped apart across sidewalks. Cardboard boxes soaked from summer thunderstorms collapsed into the streets. And the smell. Well, if you've ever left a garbage can sitting outside during 90-degree weather, you already know exactly how that smelled. Around 3 o'clock, a black SUV stopped outside my gate. Out stepped HOA President Monica Hale wearing sunglasses, a navy business suit, and the kind of confident smile people wear when they think they're about to win an argument. Behind her came 2 board members and a man carrying a leather briefcase who introduced himself as their attorney. Monica walked up to my porch without waiting for an invitation. "Mrs. Carter," she began, "you're interfering with essential public services." I set my lemonade on the porch rail. No, I replied calmly. I'm declining access across my private property. She pointed toward the subdivision. Those families need garbage collection. So did my chickens need a place to sleep. Her smile disappeared. The attorney stepped forward. We believe the access road has become essential infrastructure. I handed him copies of the survey and the original access agreement. He read the first page, then the second, then slowly looked back at Monica without saying a word. She reached for the papers herself, scanning the highlighted paragraph that allowed termination of commercial access under specific conditions. This can't be right, she muttered. It is, I answered. You should have read the documents before sending bulldozers onto someone else's land. Monica changed tactics. Surely we can work this out. We could have worked it out before you demolished my property. There were complaints. From whom? She hesitated. Several residents. Interesting, because I've already spoken with most of my customers, and none of them filed anything. The attorney quietly whispered something in her ear. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Trespass, property damage, exposure, settlement. Monica's shoulders sank just a little. What exactly do you want? She asked. Nothing today. They left looking far less confident than when they arrived. Meanwhile, I wasn't finished. I filed a formal civil claim for property destruction, replacement costs, lost business income. Emotional damages tied to the destruction of memorial property built by my late husband and the loss of my registered heritage flock. Animal Services confirmed they had never been contacted by the HOA before demolition, which meant the board had simply hired a contractor to remove everything without coordinating with the proper authorities. Then I called the local newspaper. I didn't exaggerate anything. I simply showed the reporter photographs of my demolished coop beside pictures taken the week before I left for Wisconsin. The contrast spoke for itself. Sunday's headline read, Retired farmer says HOA destroyed family chicken coop on private property. By Monday morning, television crews were filming garbage piled shoulder-high beside the subdivision entrance, while frustrated homeowners complained that the HOA's dispute had turned their neighborhood into a landfill. Realtors canceled weekend open houses because prospective buyers refused to step out of their cars after smelling the air from half a block away. The subdivision developer called an emergency meeting with the HOA board. Property values had started slipping, online reviews mocked the community, and residents demanded answers. That afternoon, Monica returned alone. This time there was no designer suit, no attorney, no board members. Just a tired woman carrying a folder. We'd like to rebuild the coop, she said quietly. We'll replace every chicken we can. We'll pay for the damages. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. The coop isn't the only thing you destroyed. She nodded without arguing. Then tell me how to fix it. I slid a prepared contract across the porch table. This is a new commercial driveway license. $3,000 per month, paid on the first of every month. Miss one payment, the license terminates immediately, and the chain goes back across the driveway. She stared at the number. $3,000. That's considerably cheaper than building another entrance. She knew it. I knew it. We both sat there in silence while she calculated the cost of engineering studies, highway permits, environmental reviews, land acquisition, drainage work, and months of construction. Compared to all that, my monthly fee was a bargain. And if we refuse? She asked. I smiled politely. Then I wish you the best of luck explaining another month of garbage to your residents. She signed before the ink on the first page had dried. 3 weeks later, craftsmen finished a brand new chicken coop, larger and stronger than the original. Friends from nearby farms donated replacement hens. Neighbors volunteered lumber and fencing, and every Saturday the line for fresh eggs became even longer than before. The funniest part wasn't rebuilding what I'd lost. It was opening my mailbox on the first day of every month and finding a check from the very people who once claimed my little chicken coop was hurting property values. In the end, it turned out the most valuable piece of real estate in Cedar Ridge wasn't their clubhouse, their pool, or their perfectly landscaped entrance. It was the quiet little driveway they had spent years pretending didn't belong to me. People ask me all the time if I ever enjoyed watching that neighborhood struggle with mountains of garbage, and the truth usually surprises them. Not really. I didn't wake up every morning hoping someone else's life would become miserable. I never wanted raccoons digging through trash bags, families canceling backyard cookouts, or kids holding their noses while walking to the school bus. Most of those homeowners had absolutely nothing to do with the decision that destroyed my chicken coop. They were just ordinary people who trusted the folks they elected to the HOA board to make reasonable decisions. Unfortunately, that's the problem with power. It only takes a handful of arrogant people at the top to create consequences for everyone underneath them. Looking back now, I don't think Monica and the rest of the board woke up one morning planning to ruin an old widow's livelihood. I think they slowly convinced themselves that because they had authority inside their subdivision, they had authority everywhere around it. That's a dangerous assumption. According to standard procedure, property rights don't disappear simply because someone forms a committee or prints a book of neighborhood rules. Boundaries exist for a reason, and good neighbors respect them whether they agree with each other or not. From a legal perspective, this entire mess could have been avoided with one simple conversation, one phone call, or even one knock on my front door. Instead, they skipped straight to bulldozers because they believed they would never be challenged. This is a psychological trap that shows up in every part of life. Once people stop hearing the word no, they begin believing it no longer applies to them. They confuse confidence with authority, convenience with entitlement, and eventually they stop asking permission because they assume permission is automatic. That's exactly what happened here, and the moment they forgot where their authority ended, they handed all the leverage to the one person they underestimated. The lesson here is bigger than chickens, garbage trucks, or homeowners associations. It's about remembering that respect is always cheaper than conflict. Had they simply walked up my driveway and said, "We have concerns. Can we talk?" I would have listened. I've always listened. Maybe we would have planted more shrubs to hide the coop. Maybe we could have adjusted the fencing or landscaping. Maybe nothing would have changed at all, but at least we would have been neighbors having an honest conversation instead of strangers preparing legal documents. Instead, they chose force over respect, and once that line was crossed, trust disappeared with it. Today my new coop is stronger than the first one. My flock is thriving again. And every Saturday morning, I still hand cartons of fresh eggs to smiling customers, including a few families from Cedar Ridge who quietly admitted they never supported what the board did. Every month, the HOA's payment arrives exactly on time, not because they suddenly love my chickens, but because contracts have a funny way of reminding people where assumptions end and reality begins. Every time I unlock my mailbox and see that check, I don't think about revenge anymore. I think about Walter. He used to tell me, "You don't win by yelling louder than the other person. You win by knowing exactly where you stand before the argument even starts." Turns out he was right. Sometimes the strongest fence isn't made of wood or steel. It's made of paperwork that nobody bothered to read until it was too late. So now I'd love to hear what you think. Did the HOA deserve everything that happened after they crossed the line? Or should I have accepted their apology and reopened the driveway without asking for a monthly access agreement? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark interesting conversations. And if you enjoy real-world property disputes where patience, preparation, and accountability matter more than shouting matches, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.